do you mind just giving a quick recap on the spiral for the people that weren't here yesterday? Well, you guys that were here yesterday know what we did, right? You know all the stuff we went through. And I said, okay, I'm going to give a run at this. But let me just say this, even for the ones of you that have been here and were at all the Saturday sessions, the things that I have presented and how they relate to the biblical narrative and why they relate to my life and why they relate to our marriage and why they relate to our kids and our grandkids and the world in which we live. Because again, if stuff like this is just a head model, we don't care. Danae and I only care about things that we see that really impact our relationship. That's where it counts, right? And we're all that way. I mean, the most important things in your life right now are the relationships you have. And so we're the same way. So I hit Spiral Dynamics 20 years ago. So what I presented yesterday was me trying to figure out a way to convey some of the main points of Spiral Dynamics and take 20 years and condense it into, okay, let's do it one day, where I do 20 years of things that I've gotten out of the spiral. So it was it was difficult for me to do a brief presentation of the spiral yesterday. Now what am I going to do? I will do like a 5-minute what is Spiral Dynamics? And then, as you can tell, I have an extremely technical chart here. Very complicated. We're going to fill it in, have some fun, and I have promised all weekend that I'm going to get into the future of faith today and offer some things for you to think about. They are things that are not well accepted in the more conservative, fundamentalist type churches from which I came, and those things would be reflected in that blue round circle called traditional. I'm not going to talk about the other circles. Traditional, modern, and postmodern are flavors of Christianity over the last 2,000 years. When you talk about the values of a traditional age, and by the way, this model is not a religious model. It's used by consultants who consult in various countries for Fortune 500 in business, or they consult in philosophy, they consult in global economics, and they've used this spiral. I took the spiral and applied it to the biblical narrative and to religion. Because the principles are the same, they're worldviews. What happened in the worldview of the traditionals, we got a traditional, institutional Jesus from the Holy Roman Empire, and that traditional church was the traditional church for 1,500 years. That was it. If you have attended or still attend Protestant churches, you didn't exist for 1,500 years. The only thing that existed was a worldview that produced a blue meme, which is, have values, each meme has values, that valued law. And from that law came terms like creedal, doctrine, dogma. Those are law terms. And so what you find in traditional churches is mostly called fundamental principle or fundamentalism, because the main thing is about, did you keep the rules correctly in order to be pleasing to God, so that hopefully you would not go to a place of eternal torment. And that law-based thinking was what determined your identity. Were you obedient, disobedient, faithful, unfaithful, believer, heretic? Okay? And we talked about that and how I've enjoyed the latter for quite a few years now. In my work, that's okay, because that's how new worldviews evolve. Anytime a new world was coming into being, and these all bring about different ways of saying, anytime that happened, there was resistance because it was outside the form of what people believed at the time. It was out of the box, as we would say today. When you get into modernity, that's where Luther appears in church history. In the traditional age, the primary thing was you did not question authority, you did not question the Pope, you did not question the priest, you did not question authority. And we know that when you don't question authority, like in the priesthood, sometimes corruption starts happening, it becomes widespread, and nothing's ever done about it because no one is allowed to question the priest. Well, when you move into Luther, what does modernity do? It questions. That's one of its big values. It questions. It's a pushback a bit against you don't question. And so in modernity, you have Luther. What does Luther do? He protests. He questions. That leads to protest, which is the protesting movement, the Protestant movement. And it is here that the Protestant movement shows up. And once people are allowed to question and have ideas of their own, you end up with a whole proliferation of new denominations. And this is where denominationalism really explodes. You have Wesley, you have Calvin, you have Arminianism, which is a free choice, versus Calvinism. And then, of course, under that, there are many, many others that come along with that. And then once you have that, and you have modernity, and I would compare a modern church, I compared it yesterday to megachurches. Megachurches fit, what is modernity? How can we be more efficient? How can we be more efficient? How can we make it happen? Okay, I go to a mega church, I drive up, they got cones, they got police officers, I go right in, I park, I go inside. Man, what a performance. They got a band, they got music, it's awesome, we rock. Then the preacher comes up, he has a well-customized 20-minute message that doesn't make me late for the cafeteria. I depart quickly, the police are out there, and I beat all the Baptists to the cafeteria. All right, that's a real general ha-ha, but it does have elements that you will identify with. Now, postmodernity is what a lot of us started moving into when we had groups like this, and still have groups like this, and then are thinking about what else can there be, which is what I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And in postmodernity, the main values are inclusion, justice, equality. Those are the things that were really missing in modernity. Modernity was more cold, like modern buildings. They didn't have the warmth of the traditional building. If you think about furniture, the traditional worldview produced traditional furniture. The modern worldview produced modern furniture. And you're going to do one or the other for your house, for example. And you can tell the difference between. Do you like that modern, shiny glass, steel, or do you like, I love going to John's house. He's got a Victorian house. I love that Victorian warmth. I feel more, but that's opinion. You know, you go to London and it's more male-oriented architecture, blah, blah, blah. You go to Paris and it's more feminine in the way it flows. So these are all worldviews of the way these things work. And that brings us to the fact that eventually you move into second tier, which is that you realize that every single worldview that's happened is what brought me here today. And that I have within me values that are existent in every single worldview since the beginning of humans. And now the challenge for me is to recognize, how do I look at my archaic instinctual self from a healthy, unhealthy standpoint? What are the healthy things about my instinctive self? What are the unhealthy things about my self? What are the healthy things about my tribal? That's family. It starts, automatically with family. What are the unhealthy things that I have in tribal? And I am very blessed in that sense to have Denaida to constantly tell me what those unhealthy things are. So, and that's a joke. And the same all the way up. So that's kind of a summary is when you get into integral consciousness or second tier, you're integrating more things. That's why the spiral gets bigger as it goes up. The world becomes so much more complex. This is not grandma's world anymore. My grandmother and grandfather lived on a farm in West Virginia. He still used a horse and plow. I remember when they got their first TV set, my dad grew up there and he was that guy. He literally walked a mile to school. Those people did exist, and sometimes in the snow. He grew up, they had gas heat because the gas company in West Virginia ran a pipeline through their farm property and put them on gas. Otherwise, they were doing wood-burning stove, wood-burning everything else. So that was just a couple generations ago. And now all of a sudden, modernity and boom. Change is happening. It's always happened. It's happening now. Whatever I think today is most likely going to change tomorrow. And what I'm now going to present to you has to do with changes that I am proposing, and they reflect conversations that I am currently having with a lot of different people, including people that have nothing to do with religion. That the principles that come out of the biblical narrative are principles I'm bringing up to them, and they have otherwise had no desire to talk about anything that smacks of Bible. Bible to a lot of people is, yeah, you mentioned a Bible verse. Oh gosh, I didn't realize it was that late. And I gotta go, you know. So we know that, right? So we know that's the way that works. Okay, so some of those fields, this is a historical developmental model. So I talk to people in Spiral Dynamics who are consultants in a lot of different fields. We have them into our presence place, and I say, you know, this is what I'm seeing. Tell me what you think. Here's the way I see the biblical narrative. I see it as the evolution of spiritual consciousness. That's what I'm seeing here. And it goes through archaic Adam, it goes through tribal Abraham and the 12 tribes. It moves into warrior Israel, whose lens was go kill the enemy, drive out the enemy, destroy the city. It goes all the way up into traditional, where all of a sudden we have empire and institution, throne of David for politics, and we have a temple built for institutional religion. And on we go. So, okay, 10,000 feet. That's our recap, and that brings me to what I said I would talk about today. Now, where I left off, and I'll get over here, and I'll try to make this where everyone can read it large enough. What I said yesterday was the trajectory of the spiral is that you have two tiers, two different ways of seeing and thinking. The first one is really represented by separation thinking until the integral, and then it integrates everything. So you're not integrating everything when you're in a blue fundamentalist. You're not integrating everything even when you're in different denominations. So now we're going to talk about, okay, what are you trying to get to? Where are you going? So the first thing we said was the biblical narrative itself starts with form. Form. That's where it starts. What do we mean by form? So I used Paul as an example to say, here's where everything started, is in form. What do we mean by form? Paul says, well, over here you have two mountains. And in form, Paul says we're talking about Mount Sinai. Law appears in the traditional age, which is what Israel entered into after her warrior years. And form requires boundaries. How would I know what the form of something is unless I knew what its boundaries were, of a table, of a chair, whatever. So if you have boundaries in religion, what you're trying to do is you're trying to determine the boundaries in which the truth resides. And once you've determined those, blue, when I was a fundamentalist, what did I think about the form of truth? It was a thing to be defended. For you to say to me, well, have you ever thought about, I'd be like, what are you talking about? Whoa. That's outside the boundaries of what the Bible says. The Bible says, and I had an interpretation of everything in the Bible. And then some guy came along and said, well, have you ever thought it could be interpreted different? No, because I have the form of truth, and I'm going to defend it, defend the truth. All right, that's how, so you have to have boundaries. Well, now what do we do? There has to be some type of law that says whether or not you are inside the boundaries or outside the boundaries, whether you're obedient, disobedient, faithful, unfaithful, etc., etc., etc. And so when we're starting in form, what does that require? It requires my doing. I've got to get it right. I have to interpret it right. I have to have the right theology. I have to have the right belief system. I have to have the right denomination. I have to get it right. I have to be in the box called truth. And that requires law. And so I better set up in my denomination some kind of hierarchy of authority, and they're going to tell the rest of us whether or not we're kosher or not. They're going to tell us whether we're faithful or unfaithful. They're going to hire a pastor and make sure that the pastor is teaching the things that stay within the bounds of that particular denomination. I talked to those pastors for decades, and the concern they have is they're seeing things beyond the boundaries of where their congregation and their denomination is, and they're wondering, how do you get someone to start moving beyond those boundaries without losing your job? Because I got kids in college, and I got a house note, and on and on. So form, what else is involved in form? So you got form, you got law, you have to have a law. Something else I'll throw in here, and I'm going to bring it up again. This is an extremely important concept. Division can only happen in the realm of form. Why? Because the other thing we're going to talk about is over here, where the biblical narrative goes, and it's going to go from form to formless. Why? Because at Mount Sinai, it's just like the mountains right here. They're forms. They exist externally. They're physical forms. What happens over here? Over here, we have Mount Zion. And Mount Zion is the space from which God comes to deliver. Mount Zion. Where is Mount Zion? How do I get there? Can I see it with a telescope? Is there some way to drive there? Where does it start? Where does it end? No, it's formless. You see, just like God, just like Spirit. It doesn't have boundaries. God doesn't have boundaries. Spirit doesn't have boundaries. Mount Zion is a space that's a metaphor for God's space. We'll remember that as we go along. So what else do we have here? I'll bring up one more. There's a bunch of them, but I'll bring up two more. I'm going to bring up Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a geographical city. It was the center of Israel's God identity. So Jerusalem, again, it's a geographical place. It's a form. It's a city you can go to. It has walls around it. It's an external form. All right. Where were things headed? Paul said where we're headed, and Paul said this, and Peter said this, and John said this, and it's all over the narrative. Some denominations talk about it a lot, and some denominations don't talk about this at all. And that is what was coming, according to those three apostolic writers, and what was coming was called a New Jerusalem. And I'm going to say, even if you grew up not talking about this much, the New Jerusalem, maybe you had kind of a sketchy idea of what is that, or what's that mean, or is that something that's coming down the line, down in the future? And some denominations are like, well, it will when the planet Earth burns up and Jesus comes back. And see, that denomination talks about it from that perspective. What we say at Presence is that the biblical narrative, once we move into this integrated lens of seeing and interpreting those same verses, is that actually those things are going to move from catastrophic to constructive. That's a phrase I use all the time. We're going to move from catastrophic to constructive. All right, I'll explain what that means. So what about the New Jerusalem? How do I Google that? I mean, I want to get my Google map out. I put in New Jerusalem, and it doesn't come up. And if you can get something that Google can't find, well, you've done something, right? So this is formless. The New Jerusalem is formless. I can do the same thing with temple. What is the temple? The temple was a form. How was that form constructed? It had a rectangular part that was called the holy place. Then it had a part above that, a square, that was called the Holy of Holies. What did that mean to the people of Israel, that temple? What did it mean? They believed that God dwelt in the Holy of Holies. The presence of God was literally in that Holy of Holies. Now remember I talked about separation thinking. No one could go in the Holy of Holies except under penalty of death. God was separate. They worshiped God like maybe you used to think of God anthropomorphically. God is a person, okay? And there are aspects of God that Jesus made very personal. But what I'm saying here is that that Holy of Holies in that building was sacred. Again, when I was in the Blue Mean world growing up, they told us that the church building was sacred. And I don't know if you were ever in a denomination like that, but it was like the church building itself is sacred. And so, you know, if you wanted to do stuff for the youth group that was just not religious, you needed a fellowship hall. Then you could kind of go over there because it was okay over there, but you don't want to do that in the church building. It's sacred. So, much more I could say. When you get over here, what are we talking about? How does God dwell over here? Over here, the apostles are going to write, we're going to talk about them, that this represents buildings made with hands, human self as source. God does not dwell in buildings made with hands, says Stephen, and says the apostolic writers. No. When we get over here, we have a New Jerusalem, and John says, I saw no temple there. It was a God space where there was no temple. And as I said yesterday, nor did John say, but I did see a church building. He did not say that. We're going to get into where we're going. As a matter of fact, it will tie into people who describe themselves as a non-church church, which I will get to. It came right off your website, by the way, in case you don't know what your website says. I don't want to embarrass anyone here that's going, I didn't know that's what we said. So, you can see form and formless, how they're shaking out, and how we're understanding. Human understanding had to start here. That's why you have these lower levels on the spiral. You have to start there. You see, the evolution of spiritual consciousness is developmental. It's just like in school. There's people here represented that are probably in a lot of different grades. All right? And so you go to first grade, you go to second grade, you go to third grade. And it's developmental. Because when I'm in the sixth grade, I am into stuff that I could never understood when I was a first grader. And on we go. And that's the way it was. And that's why when you look, somebody asked me about original sin. I think we were talking last night. Well, no. Man is not some type of reprobate who's born into original sin. What happened was you had a 2-year-old saying no. That's the way it starts. That doesn't mean that we denigrate the 2-year-old because we give them a commandment and say, don't you do that, don't touch that, and then they do and they look at you. We've been there, haven't we? And you're like, what? What happened? What happened? The baby said no. And then it gets worse. Okay, so after that, you realize, yes, that's part of growing up. Understanding no. Understanding there are boundaries. Yeah, are there boundaries? Yes. Because you get over here, does that mean you don't have boundaries? No. It means that you don't use boundaries to determine your child's identity. You simply use boundaries to help guide them and correct them and take them to the next best stage. But you don't look at them and say, I'm sorry, we're kicking you out. You're not my kid anymore. If you did that to a child, you would be arrested in a heartbeat. The only way you could get away with that, dare I say, is if you were in religion. Okay. So, okay. It gets even worse than this. So here's what we have. So, okay, we have form and formless, and this is where the rubber meets the road, and I'm going to talk about some things now that are future faith things, as I understand them. I'm going to talk about right here. And how do you get from form to formless? Transform. Now, we've already seen, okay, this is Old Testament, Old Covenant stuff. I get that. We'll read our Old Testament. That's where it all shows up. Now we get over here, and we have New Testament stuff. And it's talking about, oh, well, no, now there's, God's space, and it's formless, and we don't go to a temple anymore, and on we go. And we move from law to grace, and on we go. But the question is, what does the biblical narrative say? How does this world, the world of form, get to this world? And that is through transform. Two things we're going to talk about. No. I have to be careful what I say, because sometimes. So two things we're going to talk about. We talk about role and function. And let's see, I'm just going to write that up here in the corner. Role and function and identity. Who am I? How would I describe myself? What is my identity? We talked about this yesterday. I'm going to go over it one more time for people that weren't here and just to reiterate what I was saying yesterday. Role and function. I am a dad. I am a husband. I am a father. I'm a grandfather. I am the president of Presence, a nonprofit. I'm a Caucasian male. Those, you see, are roles and function. They're not my identity. You see, they all belong over here. Role and function belongs to the realm of forms. Those are just forms. My biological form. I'm in this biological form. Is that it? That's my identity? The biological form I'm in? No. My identity comes from source, and the source is over here. Source determines identity. For the first 5 grades, I grew up in West Virginia, which is why I talk about it was the seat, of course, of intellectualism. So for those first 5 years, we would have family reunions, and maybe some of you all still do those kind of things. But boy, it's a big deal in West Virginia, family reunions, and I can remember being like 5 years old or something, and you're going to the family reunions, and you know some cousins and some people, but there's a lot of old people sitting in folding chairs and eating a piece of watermelon or something, and they're sitting in their folding chairs, and you're walking by, you're chasing a ball or something, and they stop you. And I was asked many times, now whose boy are you? They want to know whose boy, who I was, what's my identity, right? That's how we talk about identity. Well, the question though, when we start talking about the biblical narrative, it's going to start talking about, now wait a minute, over here your identity was determined by biological genealogy. Begat, 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 that's how you identified people, their tribe they were from. It was begatting, it was genealogy, it was biological. It allowed Ancestry.com to make a fortune. So that was identity to them. But then there's this idea of being born again that comes in. I'm going to guess that every one of you have heard of that in this room, being born again. I'm going to reframe that a bit. But what was the purpose of it? It was to say your identity is not this, your identity is this. The source determines your identity. This was my mom, this was my dad, that's my source. Oh, that's who you are. God, says the apostolic writers, is the source of your identity. Your source, who you are, who your kids are. Well, is that because they go to church now or they don't go anymore? We're going to talk about that. How are we determining identity, really? Okay, so the point I'm making is, here's where identity is. So what goes in transform? Let's have some fun. Christology. Let's think about a phrase. Jesus said, I am the way. I think we all know that one, don't we? I am the way. I used to tell everybody in other denominations that. Because Jesus was the way that my denomination became the true denomination when I was in the Blue Name world. Jesus is the way. So you say that to a Buddhist, to a Hindu, you say that to an atheist, you say, Jesus said, I am the way. All right, let's continue thinking. The word way. Is the word way, where would we put it in the Venn diagram? This and the way to this. Way is a transformed word. Jesus was the way, but God was the place. Jesus, I quoted the African proverb yesterday. I pointed to the moon, and all you saw was my finger. You see, this was supposed to be transformative. It was supposed to draw your eyes from where they are now to something beyond. And all you did was attach to the finger as your identity. So what I'm proposing and what I'm going to go through is the reason why Christology is not identity. It is transformed. What is identity? God. I'm differentiating between Christ and God. Now this is a long discussion, which they're having in seminaries right now, right and left. I talked to someone that was in a Methodist seminary, maybe a year ago. They took a Christology course, and the guy told me, because he is seeing a difference now, and we're going to get into, well, then what's the role and function of Jesus? If Jesus is role and function in God's identity, how does that work? And what he said was, they took a poll in their class, how many of you believe that Jesus is God in every single way? Jesus was fully God in every way. And there were only a couple. Why? Well, because identity comes from Father. Father is source. Son gets identity from the source. What's the source of the Son? Father. Jesus always pointed to the Father. Of myself I can do nothing, he said. John, the one who sins is greater than the one who is sent. Once again, the Gospel of John. The words that I speak are not my own. Of myself, Jesus said, I can do nothing. And in fact, the whole point of transform was right here. It started right here with the cross. And it has two elements to it. Transformation is just like the beginning of the spiral. The first stage, we said, archaic Adam, starts with individual. You start over here with transforming, and what does Paul say? Jesus is the last Adam. Jesus is transforming everything that came into the world through Adam. as individual. But then the second is tribal, and that's collective. Christology is also collective. How is that termed in the New Testament? What is the collective called? Well, it could be called body. It could be called ecclesia, from which eventually we got church. For 1,500 years, the Catholic Church. Now bunches of churches, tons of churches, lots of them, which I will come back to, where's the only place that division can happen. The only place in the realm of form. But here's the problem. Paul says to the Corinthians, is Christ divided? Is Christ a form? A religion? See, religions have boundaries that distinct and separate what they think from what you think. So, here's what we look at. You have body, church. There's another term that's used by Peter and by John, and they call this group that was the collective here at this time, they call this group first fruits. Now, being from West Virginia, I know about first fruits because that's agricultural. And when you read the Old Testament, which I'm sure you do quite a bit, when you read the Old Testament, they had offerings at certain times of the year that they would do at the temple. Where you go? You go to the temple and you do some kind of an offering where you would offer the first fruits of a crop up to God, the first fruit. What does that mean that you are the first fruits? What it means is that the harvest is already started, and the first fruits are the transformative model and outward indication of a greater harvest in total to come. And so you will see when you plant corn, you go out in the field, there's nothing but corn stalks. That's it. Nothing but corn stalks. All of a sudden you get over here, there's some ears of corn that are now out there. There's still mostly just corn stalks, but those ears of corn are telling the farmer harvest time is drawing near. We are moving to the whole. And that sounds a whole lot like integral, whole, complete. That's why it works really well when I talk to people in science, because science talks all about the universe, which is based on universal principles. And poor Sir Isaac Newton started over here, and everybody thought the universe was just a time and space thing. And then the quantum physicists came along and said, we're going to transform science by showing you experiments that show beyond Newtonian is non-locality, which transcends time and space. How can those two things be true at the same time, says science? It's because, as the physicists say, there must be an implicate formless order from which all these things are manifested. And now physics is turning old scientific paradigms on their ear, just as I'm attempting to do with a 2,000-year-old paradigm that's been handed down about what Christology really is and what my identity, or the way I would describe my identity today. So what happens? How is it transformed? We're going to get to a point here where transform is done. Once the harvest comes, transform's over. There's no more first fruits, it's just the harvest. You're out here into the hole. You're done. Transform's done. Okay. This process by both Jesus, it starts at the cross, dying and rising. Is that not a transform action? Dying and rising. That's transform. Okay. Jesus, the individual, is modeling transformation. Jesus is saying, and this is the faith of Christ,